All right, welcome back, grade 12 SYSE students, to another explainer. Today, we're putting on our analytical researcher hats and stepping right into the lab to perform, well, a kind of macroeconomic autopsy. We're going to critically examine national income accounting, and we're specifically focusing on a tool you're already pretty familiar with, the value-added method. Now, it looks incredibly elegant in your textbooks, right? But out in the wild, the real world of economic data is messy, it's volatile, and it is full of friction. So let's dive right into this and dissect exactly where the data breaks down. First things first, we absolutely have to establish our theoretical baseline. The value-added method basically measures national income as the sum total of net final output produced, or net value added, by all the producing units within a domestic territory during a single year. In theory, flawless. You take the gross output, you subtract intermediate consumption, factor in depreciation and taxes, and boom, you have your pure economic value. But this perfect equation assumes we have perfect data. And as we start our systematic dissection today, you're going to see just how flawed that assumption really is. Okay, so our autopsy today is going to follow a highly rigorous framework. We'll look at the perfect measurement illusion, valuation and depreciation roadblocks, classification conundrums, the shifting boundary line, and finally, the data deficit. Let's kick things off with Section 1, Valuation and Depreciation Roadblocks, or as I like to call it, the price of time. So there's a really massive paradox when it comes to inventories. Think about it. An unsold amount of goods adds to a firm's inventory, right? And because these goods reflect the current production of goods and services, they absolutely must be included in the national income. We can't just ignore them. But here's the huge hurdle for economists. How do you actually value them? By the time an unsold good is just sitting there gathering dust in a warehouse, market prices might have changed drastically. This rapid price change creates severe valuation friction. Like, are we measuring the value of the output at the exact moment it was produced, or at the moment the national income accountant is actually tallying the ledger? And that actually brings us to our next temporal roadblock, which is estimating depreciation. Remember, to get that net value added, we have to subtract depreciation from our gross output. But do national income accountants value depreciation on a historical cost basis, meaning the original cost price when those capital goods were first purchased, or do they use a replacement cost basis, which is what it would cost to replace that machinery in today's economy? This isn't just some boring accounting quirk. Picking one method over the other literally alters the final national income figure fundamentally. Moving right along to Section 2, Classification Conundrums and the deep conceptual confusion that comes with them. National income accountants are often surprisingly unclear about how to categorize certain services. Take education, for example. Is it an intermediate product? Well, you could absolutely argue it's an input that's necessary to create a capable future workforce. Or is it a final product consumed purely by the individual for their own personal betterment? The exact same logic applies to transport expenses. Is transportation an intermediate expense used simply to move goods to a market? Or is it a final service consumed when an individual just travels for leisure? This theoretical ambiguity creates some really deep conceptual confusion in our ledgers. Now for Section 3, the shifting boundary line. This is a constantly moving target. So national income accounting strictly dictates that we only include final goods. Meanwhile, intermediate goods, those non-factor inputs used in further stages of production, have to be excluded to avoid double counting. Simple enough, right? But in reality, it's nearly impossible to draw a static, clear-cut line between the two. Let's anchor this high-level theory with a super specific example. Think about flour. If flour is purchased for household use, it's a final product. It goes right into the pantry and is consumed. Done. But if that exact same bag of flour is purchased by a baker, it instantly becomes an intermediate product, used as an input to bake bread. The chemical makeup of the flour didn't change at all. So we can see that a product's classification depends entirely on its final use, not its physical properties. This constantly shifting boundary forces accountants to somehow trace the ultimate destination of millions of goods. Which brings us to Section 4. The data deficit, where the numbers literally go dark. Up until now, we've mostly talked about theoretical issues, but in many underdeveloped countries, the roadblock is fundamentally physical. There is just a chronic lack of adequate data, and the statistics that are available are often highly unreliable. But honestly, more importantly than that, underdeveloped countries often feature massive subsistence sectors. This is where farmers produce food primarily just for their own self-consumption. Now, we try to assign an imputed value based on market prices, but gathering data on millions of off-the-grid subsistence farms, it's incredibly difficult. Furthermore, you have these massive unincorporated and unorganized sectors that operate entirely outside of formal tax and banking systems. That makes their output virtually invisible to national accountants. It is a highly statistically fraught endeavor. Okay, at this point in our autopsy, you might be thinking the patient is entirely lost. But I want to remind all of you SYIC students of a really core truth in economics. Despite these massive analytical flaws, despite the shifting boundaries, the valuation arguments, and the sheer lack of data in unorganized sectors, we absolutely must push through. Why? Because this flawed data is honestly our absolute best tool. We have to accept the friction because performing this method is quite literally the only way we can reliably estimate the structural breakdown of our economy. It's the only way we can figure out the proportional share of the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors in our overall national income. The map it provides, however blurry it might be, is just vital for policy and progress. So, I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought to ponder. If our foundational macroeconomic data is built on shifting boundaries between intermediate and final goods, hotly debated depreciation estimates, and literal dark spots in the unorganized sectors, well, how accurate is our understanding of true national economic health? Next time you read the latest GDP figures in the news, remember the autopsy we performed today. Remember the friction beneath the numbers. Keep that critical mindset sharp. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the data.